For this video, we're going to spend some time looking at the verbs in Spanish because the verbs are really the heart of the Spanish language. And it's also the area where, as English speakers, we have the most trouble. And to understand why that is, we need to take a look at English versus Spanish. So if we look down here, on the English side, where it has to speak, you can see the only time that we change a verb, and it's in red, is for he, she, or it. We add an S. We would say, he speaks, she speaks, it speaks. The rest of the time, the verb doesn't change at all in the present tense. And in the past tense, if you think about it, we don't even change it for he, she, or it. So we're not used to doing verb conjugation in English. And that's why it's so hard for us to grasp the concept of it in Spanish. Because if you look at the Spanish side, each verb is going to have a different ending in red. Yo hablo. Tú hablas. Él, ella, or usted, the formal you, habla. Nosotros hablamos. Vosotros is a form that is taught a lot of times in school, but nobody in Latin America actually uses it. So it's here for you to see, but we're actually going to skip over it. And then ellos or ustedes hablan. So when you look at this and you see 6 different conjugations and you have to memorize 6 different endings only for AR verbs, it's quite overwhelming. And it's not fun. Verb conjugation is not fun at all. So the way that we're going to approach it is that we're going to take away, first of all, vosotros. And then we're not going to see nosotros, ellos, or ustedes. At least not right away. We're going to start with the yo form, because that's the most important form. You're talking about yourself. You're making positive, negative statements. And then after that, we're going to move on to the tu form. And this is going to be the majority of the work that we do in the beginning of the workbook, because you need the tu form in order to ask questions, and you need the yo form to answer them. Later on, we will get to the he, she form, él or ella. So if you look at it this way, we're really only going to see 50% of the verb conjugation at the beginning. And in this chapter, at the very beginning, we're only going to see one ending, the O ending. And that's going to make it much less overwhelming. It's going to make it much easier for you to begin speaking right away and using the verbs. And that way, you have time to get used to the idea of conjugating the verbs and what these new words mean before we go into the other conjugations. And the other thing that I like to point out is usually these actually go in order. They're not meant to, but they go in order of how often you're going to use them. So the yo form is going to be the number 1 form anyway. And then the other forms you're going to use less and less as you go. Depending on how you're using Spanish, you might never use some of these forms. So there's really not a reason for you to frustrate yourself now trying to memorize all the different conjugations when you definitely don't need them to begin, and you might not need them along the way. Now, something very important to point out with this is that because the verbs change so much in Spanish, you often won't see the pronoun used, or you won't hear it being used. You can say yo hablo, but you don't have to. And that's because hablo is already telling us who's speaking. So most of the time, people will leave out the yo, and they'll simply say hablo, because it's not necessary to say it. You will hear it for emphasis, or sometimes if you're working with one of the forms like LA usted that has more than one option and they want to clarify who they're talking about. But once the subject is established, people will naturally drop the pronouns and just use the verbs. Even though this is more work in the beginning for us to get used to, it's definitely better to start looking at the verbs and understanding the verbs are telling you the subject by the ending. That O is already telling me yo. And the action through the word root. If you get used to that from the beginning, you're going to have a much easier time overall with the verbs and understanding, especially spoken Spanish in conversation, because you can't expect native speakers especially to use the pronouns like we do in English. They're not going to. So you're going to be lost if you don't start relying on the verb. Now let's do a little bit of practice.